I turned 18 in a small blue house on Ash Grove Lane in Cleveland, Ohio. The paint was cracked, the porch sagged, and the air always smelled faintly of old coffee and rain. That morning, the clock on the stove blinked 7:12 a.m. when my mother placed a chipped mug in front of her.
She didn't look at me.
My father sat across the table, folding his hands the way he did when bad news was coming. The silence stretched until it felt like a wall pressing against my chest. Then she said it, slow and sharp. "We can't take your burden anymore." I didn't answer. My father sighed through his nose. He said I was too much trouble, that keeping me was too expensive, that I needed to learn to stand on my own. He packed 2 trash bags with my clothes and set them by the door. I watched him do it like I was watching a stranger clean up after a party I hadn't been invited to. By the time the sun hit the window, I was standing on the sidewalk with $40 in my pocket and a duffel bag that smelled like detergent. I didn't cry. I didn't even look back. I walked until my legs hurt, then stopped at the bus station and sat on a bench near locker 38, where I kept a small box. Inside was a faded photo of me as a toddler, a piece of blue ribbon, and a toy button that didn't work anymore. I'd kept them without knowing why, maybe to prove I existed before this life began. That first night, I called Joe Miller, a man who had once fixed my bike for free when I was 14. He owned a little repair shop on St. Clair Avenue. I told him I needed work, any work. He didn't ask questions. He told me to come in the next morning. I slept under the station awning with my bag for a pillow, my jacket pulled over my head, and the sound of trucks in the distance. Joe was the kind of man who looked tough but spoke softly. He called me kid and handed me a broom. I swept floors, wiped tools, and learned to listen to the hum of engines. He paid me in cash $6 an hour at first, then $8, then $10. When he saw I had nowhere to go, he dragged an old cot into the storage room and said I could stay there. The cot squeaked, but it was warm and safe. I worked long hours and kept my head down. The 2 people who had raised me used to call me Jay. They'd cut my hair short when I was 10 and told neighbors I was their son. I didn't understand it then, but I knew not to argue. By the time I left, being Jay felt more real than anything else. I learned how to move like a boy, talk like one, and hide behind silence. I didn't know who I really was. By 20, I had saved enough to rent a small room above a bakery near Lake Erie. The walls were thin, the floor creaked, and the air always smelled of cinnamon. I bought a used bed for $50 and a lamp from a thrift store. My paycheck barely covered rent, but I made it work. I kept my savings in a jar behind a loose floorboard, $300 some months, 50 others. Still, for the first time in my life, no one told me I was a burden. At 22, I bought a second-hand Toyota Corolla, silver with a dented side. It was mine, and that felt like freedom. I drive along the lake at night and watch the city lights flicker on the water, telling myself I belonged here, somewhere between the noise and the quiet. When Joe retired and sold the shop, I found work in a hotel kitchen near Public Square. I started washing dishes for $12 an hour. I loved the rhythm, the clatter of plates, the hiss of oil, the calls of behind and hot. I begged the chef to teach me to cook, and he did. I learned knife work, timing, and balance. By 28, I could handle the grill on a packed Friday night. The heat burned my arms, but it made me feel alive. Cleveland was home, but I dreamed bigger. I used to whisper city names under my breath while scrubbing pans: New York, Chicago, Seattle. Each name sounded like a door waiting to open. On my 31st birthday, I got a call from a luxury restaurant in Chicago. They needed a line cook, someone who could move fast and stay calm. I packed my duffel bag, took my knives, and boarded a bus west. When the city skyline came into view, something inside me stirred, a mix of fear and hope. The restaurant was called Hale House. Marble floors, soft lights, silver cutlery that gleamed under chandeliers. I started with salads, then moved to hot appetizers. My hourly pay was $21, but it felt like gold. I rented a small studio in Lincoln Park for $1,050 a month, tiny, but it had a window that faced the street. I taped a photo of Lake Erie inside my cabinet to remind myself how far I'd come. By then, birthdays had become just another shift, another date on the calendar. But one slow Thursday in early spring changed everything. A tall man in a white jacket walked through the kitchen doors. He moved like someone used to being obeyed. Gray hair at his temples, sharp blue eyes, and an air of quiet authority. The chefs called him Mr. Hale, the owner. He nodded at each station, asked questions about the menu, and finally stopped in front of me. For a moment, he just stared. His eyes narrowed, then widened. He looked at me the way someone looks at a ghost that just breathed. "Is that you?" he whispered. I froze, spatula in hand. "Yes," I said carefully. His hands trembled. His voice broke as he stepped closer. You're actually my daughter." The world stopped. I heard plates clatter somewhere behind me, but everything else faded. The noise, the heat, the smell of garlic and wine. The room tilted, the air thinned, and I could only stare at him. He looked like a man who had been waiting 30 years for this moment. And I, someone who had never believed in miracles, realized one had just found me. The next morning, I stood outside Richard Hale's office, my hands cold even in my pockets. The city hummed below, cars gliding through wet streets after a light rain. Inside, the restaurant lights flickered against the glass, and for the first time in my life, someone was waiting for me. When I walked in, he rose from behind his desk, eyes heavy but warm. He looked older than he had in the kitchen the night before. Maybe it was the daylight, or maybe it was the weight of everything he'd carried alone. His office smelled faintly of coffee and citrus polish. "Please," he said, his voice quiet. "Sit down." He began to talk, his words spilling like a dam breaking after years of silence. His name was Richard Hale, and he was not just the owner of Hale House but also of 2 other restaurants along the Chicago River. He told me I had been taken from a white brick house in Evanston when I was 5 years old. My mother, Elaine, had gone to the grocery store that morning. He had fallen asleep on the couch watching the news, and when he woke, the door was wide open. My red shoes were gone. My small backpack was gone.
So was I.
He said the search never stopped. For years, they printed flyers and contacted every police station from Illinois to Michigan. My picture, missing front tooth and all, was on lampposts, newspapers, and even milk cartons. They offered a $100,000 reward for information, draining nearly everything they had. He sold a townhouse, one of his restaurants, and his car, all to keep the search alive. His wife, Elaine, had never recovered. She'd stand by the window each night, waiting for a sound, a call, anything. He paused when he spoke of her. "She died 6 years later," he said softly. "Heart failure. The doctors called it that, but I know better. She died because she couldn't find you." I sat frozen. My hands lay still on my knees, trembling only slightly. My throat burned, but no tears came. I thought about the blue house in Cleveland, the peeling paint, the smell of damp laundry. I remembered being told I was a burden, that I should be grateful for a roof. Those memories pressed against this new truth like 2 puzzle pieces that didn't fit. I finally asked, "How do you know it's me?" Richard leaned forward, his voice steady but soft. "There's a small scar under your chin. You got it when you climbed the fence to chase a butterfly in our yard. You were 4. His eyes glistened. "And your mother. She made you a little locket with a pressed flower inside. It was her way of keeping you close." My chest tightened. I thought of the small metal box I kept in the bus station locker, the one I hadn't opened in years. Inside was a faded ribbon, a photo, and that same locket. He stood and picked up his phone. Within minutes, people began moving, his lawyer, Melissa Grant, his friend at the state lab, a retired detective who still carried my case file. They spoke in calm tones, but the air in the room felt electric. For the first time in my life, the world seemed to move because of me.
They took a quick DNA swab.
I didn't know what to feel. Hope, disbelief, fear that I might lose this miracle as quickly as it appeared. When I left his office, the city felt unfamiliar. Every sound was sharper, every color brighter. That night, I went back to work. The kitchen was loud with clanging pans and shouts, but I moved through it like a ghost. Richard stood quietly near the door, watching. I could feel his eyes on me as I chopped parsley and stirred the sauce. It wasn't judgment, it was something like wonder. After closing, he asked if he could walk me home. I hesitated, then nodded. Chicago's wind was gentle that night, the kind that makes streetlights look like gold coins on wet pavement. When we reached my apartment building, he stood by the window and looked out at the glowing skyline. "If the test proves what I already know," he said, "you'll always have a home with me." His voice wavered slightly. "There's a trust in your name, one that's been frozen since the day you disappeared. It's grown over the years, but I don't care about that. I care that I lost my daughter, and somehow, against every law of logic, she's standing in front of me." I wanted to say something, but words wouldn't come. So I just nodded, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to pretend to be strong. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning between the past and the possibility of a future I couldn't quite believe in. At 6:03 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Melissa, the lawyer. "Can you come to my office?" she said. "We have the results." The building on Wacker Drive had tall glass walls and gray carpet that muffled every step. Richard was already there, eyes rimmed red from no sleep. Melissa handed me a white envelope. The paper inside was short and clinical, but the numbers glared back at me like fire, 99.998%. Richard pressed both hands over his face and let out one broken sob. I didn't cry, but I felt something shift deep in my chest, something like the release of years of tension. By noon, everything changed again. The detective called to say the couple who had raised me had been arrested a month ago on fraud charges in Indiana. During questioning, they'd bragged about a secret they thought no one would ever uncover. They had taken me to get revenge on my father after losing a business lawsuit against him 26 years ago. The evidence was overwhelming. They were being charged with kidnapping and fraud. Bail denied. I didn't feel joy, only a strange quiet, like standing in an empty church after the candles have gone out. That evening, Richard asked if I'd go with him somewhere. We drove north, past the river and into a tree-lined street of old brick homes. He stopped in front of one with black shutters and a white door. "This was your home," he said. "It's still yours." Inside, everything smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish. He led me upstairs to a small room painted pale yellow. A white bed, a shelf full of children's books, a little desk with a framed photo of a smiling girl with dark hair, me. On the ceiling, faded stars still glowed faintly in the dark. Richard stood in the doorway, his eyes full of tears. "I didn't change anything," he said quietly. "I couldn't. I touched the photo, then the stars. And for the first time since I was a child, I cried, not from sadness, but from recognition. I had found my name again, my past, my father. And for the first time in 26 years, I finally felt like I had come home." I moved into the house on a bright Sunday morning. The air smelled of lilacs drifting from the neighbor's yard, and the street was lined with tall, graceful trees that had stood there longer than I had been alive. The house itself was red brick with black shutters and tall windows that glowed when sunlight hit them. Richard stood at the door holding a brass key in his hand. "Welcome home," he said. His smile reached all the way to his eyes. Inside, everything felt both familiar and foreign. The hallways smelled faintly of lemon polish. Paintings lined the walls, landscapes, family portraits, a few old photos framed in silver. A woman named Carmen came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She gasped when she saw me and covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. "My God," she whispered. "You're really here." She hugged me so tightly, I could hardly breathe. She'd worked for Richard's family for over 30 years and had taken care of me as a toddler. She said she'd prayed for this day every night since I disappeared. Richard led me upstairs. "This was your room," he said, opening a white door. I stepped into a soft yellow space filled with light. The small bed was still there, neatly made, the same bookshelf against the wall with a few children's books, and the same painted stars on the ceiling, faded now, but still visible. On the little desk sat a framed photo of a laughing girl with tangled hair and a missing front tooth.
Me.
I ran my fingers over the glass. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Later that day, we sat in the kitchen where the marble counters gleamed like frost. Richard made pancakes. He burned the first batch, and Carmen laughed at the sight of it. We ate together on the island, sunlight pooling on the table like gold. It felt unreal, but in the quiet between laughter, I realized this was what a real morning could sound like. No tension. No shouting. Just peace. After lunch, Melissa, the family lawyer, arrived carrying a stack of papers. She explained there had been a trust fund set up by my grandfather, a grocer who had emigrated from Europe decades ago. It was intended for my education and my first home. When I was kidnapped, it had been frozen. Over the years, through careful investments, it had grown to over $2.4 million. The number looked unreal on paper. I stared at it without understanding. Richard watched me with a mix of pride and sorrow. I didn't know whether to smile or cry. I'd spent my whole life counting coins, working double shifts, and here was money meant for me all along, locked away in time. That night, I lay awake in my old room, listening to the quiet creaks of the house. Outside, the city hummed faintly. For the first time, I didn't have to worry about rent or bills. But money didn't erase the years of loneliness. It didn't fix the lost birthdays or the empty holidays. Still, it offered something else, stability. A chance to start again, without fear. The next morning, I told Richard the first wanted to keep working at the restaurant. "I'm not ready to just stop," I said. "The kitchen feels like home, too." He laughed softly. "I thought you'd say that." He agreed, but only on one condition: I had to take weekends off sometimes. He insisted I join the training program with the head chef. "You've got real talent," he told me. "A good hand and an eye for balance. You could lead a kitchen one day if you want." His words stayed with me. The following week, I treated myself to small luxuries: a proper coat that fit, new boots that didn't rub my feet raw, and a second-hand bike I bought for $300 to ride along Lake Michigan. I mailed a letter to Joe Miller, the mechanic who had given me my first job, along with a check for $10,000. I wrote, "You saved me when no one else would. This is just a thank you for giving me a place to start." He called me 2 days later, crying on the phone, saying he couldn't believe it. News about my case spread quickly, though we refused all interviews. The detectives said the kidnappers had pleaded guilty to avoid a public trial. The prosecutor called it mercy for the victim, but I called it freedom. I didn't need to face them. I just wanted peace. On a warm evening in June, Richard and I sat at the dining table with the windows open. The smell of blooming roses drifted in. He told me stories about my mother, Elaine. She loved crossword puzzles and lemon cake. She used to hum while folding laundry and hated ticking clocks. "You have her eyes," he said. His voice cracked when he spoke her name. I reached across the table and took his hand. "You found me," I said softly. That's what she would have wanted. A few weeks later, I found myself painting again. As a child, I used to doodle on the backs of old receipts. Now, I set up an easel in the sunroom and painted scenes of the river, the markets, the faces of people who smiled without knowing I was studying them. It was therapy, color by color. The city felt alive in a way it never had before. Every morning, I walked down to the river, bought a cup of coffee, and watched boats drift under the bridges. That was where I met Mariah, Richard's office manager. She handled the restaurant's finances and schedules. She was sharp, funny, and practical, the kind of person who could fix anything with a phone call. We had lunch together one afternoon and became fast friends. She told me her brother, Thomas, ran a small grilled cheese food truck in Logan Square that people lined up for every Friday. 2 weeks later, I spent the afternoon helping him prep ingredients, laughing as melted cheese dripped everywhere. It was simple, messy joy. For the first time, I started saving for myself, not for survival, but for a dream. I put aside $500,000 into an account for a home I might buy one day.
Not yet, though.
I wasn't ready to leave Astor Street. The sound of Richard's footsteps in the hallway, Carmen humming as she cleaned, and the smell of fresh coffee in the morning made the house feel alive. Sometimes I'd wake early, stand by my window, and watch the sunrise spill over the rooftops. I'd whisper, "I'm home," and every time I said it, I believed it a little more. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. I wore a dark dress and sat beside Melissa, the lawyer who had stood by me through every step of this long and tangled road. My palms were cold, but my mind was calm. The people who had taken my childhood sat just a few rows ahead, their backs stiff, their faces gray. They didn't turn around, not once. I didn't need them to. Their silence was its own confession. The judge spoke for nearly an hour, reading through the case file with a voice that carried both authority and weariness. When she reached the verdict, I barely heard the words, "Guilty on all counts." The sentences were long enough that they would never walk free again.
Justice had a sound that day.
It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was steady, final, and quiet. I didn't speak when it was over. I only lowered my head, whispering a small prayer of thanks for the truth, for safety, for the chance to live without fear. Richard put his hand on my shoulder as we left the courtroom, and I felt the weight I'd carried for decades begin to lift. That afternoon, he asked me to come to the restaurant at 6. He didn't say why, only that it was important. When I arrived, the dining room was empty except for a long table near the front window. 5 chairs were set neatly around it. 2 framed photographs, one of my mother, Elaine, her smile soft and bright, and one of me at 5 years old, all missing teeth and sunlight. The 3rd chair was clearly meant for me, the 4th for Richard, and the 5th was left empty, as if waiting for the future. The staff stood in the doorway watching quietly. When I stepped closer, they clapped once, just once, then fell silent. It sounded like a heartbeat. Richard came over, his eyes glassy. "I can't give you back birthdays," he said, his voice breaking, "but I can give you every dinner I have left." We sat together while Carmen brought out lemon chicken, garlic beans, and soft bread. For dessert, a cake that tasted like June, fresh berries, vanilla cream, and a hint of lemon like my mother used to bake. Richard lifted his glass.
"To second chances," he said.
"And to finding what was never lost, only waiting." Halfway through the meal, he told me his plan. He wanted to create a scholarship in my name for children who had grown up without safety, without family, or without papers to prove who they were. "They deserve a door to open," he said. His idea hit me straight in the heart. I told him I'd match every dollar he put in. We wrote the figure down on a napkin, $200,000 to start. The staff heard and cheered from the kitchen, banging pans like bells. It was the most beautiful noise I'd ever heard. The next few months moved quickly. I stayed on the line at Hale House, running the pasta station most nights. Between shifts, I took 2 community college classes, food science and small business finance. I wanted to know everything about running a kitchen, from ingredients to accounting. Richard said that someday, when I was ready, I'd have my own restaurant. For now, he wanted me to learn every corner of his. On Sundays, I drove the old Corolla to the lake, parked near the pier, and read until sunset. I still liked the hum of silence, but now it felt peaceful instead of empty. On Mondays, I started house hunting. I'd saved for my trust, and I wanted a place that felt like mine. Not the house I was stolen from, not the one I'd been trapped in, but something new, something earned. One property caught my heart. A 3-bedroom brick row house on North Sedgwick Street with ivy crawling up the side and a small patch of yard that caught morning sun. The asking price was $1.18 million. I stood inside that space, running my hand along the wall, imagining laughter echoing through the hallways, a dog sleeping near the fire, a kitchen full of the scent of butter and herbs. It wasn't just a house. It was the future I had fought for without knowing it. I offered $1.1 million. When the agent called to say it was accepted, I sat in my car and cried. Then I called Richard. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, just breathed into the phone. Then he said, "Welcome home again, Isabella." We moved a few things from Astor Street, a lamp from my childhood room, 2 old cookbooks, and a wool throw that had belonged to my mother. Richard insisted the rest stay where it was. "That house will always be here," he said. "It's our history. Yours will be built from it." On the first night in my new home, I cooked pasta from scratch, kneading dough until my hands ached. I melted butter with lemon, tossed it with herbs, and set the table for two. When Richard arrived with a bottle of sparkling cider, the air smelled of garlic and warmth. We ate by candlelight, telling each other small stories about the day, no grand speeches, just laughter and quiet. I told him I had bought a new bike lock because my old one was rusted. He told me he'd finally learned how to make an omelet without breaking it. We laughed until tears rolled down our cheeks. After dinner, we stood by the window, watching the city breathe. A taxi rolled by, its lights flashing on wet pavement. A man walked his dog with a blue leash. Somewhere down the street, music drifted from an open window. I looked at Richard, at the life that had come back to me in pieces, and I thought of the little girl I used to be, the one who slept under painted stars and dreamed of safety. That night, I wrote in my journal, "My name is Isabella Elaine Hale. I was taken and I was found. I was raised in lies, but I came home in truth. Now I have a father who sets the table for me, a home that holds my breath and gives it back, and a city that finally knows my name. I have a scholarship fund growing, a career blooming, and a heart that no longer flinches at kindness." The next morning, sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor. The smell of coffee drifted through the air. I opened the window and heard a train rumbling far away. I tied my shoes and walked toward the lake. The air was sharp and clean, the sky wide and forgiving. For the first time, I felt completely whole. I knew I could make breakfast for 5 on any day I wanted, the living, the lost, and the future. I wasn't a burden. I had never been. I was a story that had finally learned how to end and how to begin again.